6 days ago, Mark Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa and said something that no Canadian Prime Minister had ever said to the United States of America. He didn't say it softly. He didn't hedge it with diplomatic language. He looked directly into the cameras and told the world that the 80-year era of deep Canadian economic integration with the United States, the era built on NAFTA, on CUSMA, on $1 trillion a year in cross-border trade, was over. Not strained, not under pressure, over. The markets didn't fully believe him at first. They rarely believe politicians when they talk this big. But then the orders started going to Germany instead of Michigan. The energy contracts started routing to Norway instead of Texas. The procurement tenders that used to go to American suppliers started landing in European inboxes. And the traders who had spent their careers betting that the U.S.-Canada relationship was too deep, too intertwined, too historically embedded to ever really break, those traders started sweating. Because here is the thing nobody in the American media is telling you clearly. This isn't a trade spat. This isn't a tariff dispute that gets resolved over a dinner in Mar-a-Lago. What is unfolding right now between the United States and its largest trading partner, a country that shares a 5,500-mile border and conducts over $1 trillion in annual commerce, is a fundamental restructuring of the North American economic order. And the man driving that restructuring is not who you were expecting. Mark Carney was a central banker. He ran the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. He is not a populist, not a fire breather, not someone who governs by outrage. He understands monetary systems, capital flows, supply chains, and institutional leverage at a level that most politicians never reach. And that is precisely what makes him dangerous to the Trump administration's strategy. Because Trump's playbook, the tariffs, the threats, the aggressive rhetoric, that playbook was designed to work against politicians who react emotionally, who need to show their base they're fighting back, who get drawn into the spectacle. Carney doesn't play that game. He plays a different game entirely, and right now, he is winning it. Here is the documented sequence of events that got us here, and you need to understand this clearly, because the media has been covering each piece in isolation, when the picture only makes sense when you see it all together. February 1st, 2025. Trump imposes 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy. Canada retaliates with tariffs on $30 billion in American goods within days. The escalation begins. March 2025. Carney replaces Justin Trudeau and immediately signals that Canada's posture is changing. He doesn't soften the retaliatory tariffs, he expands them. By mid-March, Canadian counter-tariffs cover $155 billion in American exports. April 2025. Trump imposes global auto tariffs. Carney matches them. Simultaneously, he begins a diplomatic circuit, Germany, France, the UK, Japan, visiting allies and making a case for economic coordination that doesn't center the United States. August 2025. Trump raises tariffs on Canada to 35%. Carney begins signing bilateral deals with China, the UAE, Indonesia. January 2026. Canada and China lower mutual tariffs in a formal agreement. Trump threatens 100% tariffs in retaliation. February 2026. Trump threatens to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Carney doesn't blink. Here is what that sequence tells you. Every time Trump applied pressure, expecting Carney to capitulate, Carney responded by diversifying away from the pressure point. He didn't fight the tariff war on American terms. He changed the terrain. Picture the room in Ottawa where this strategy was being designed. It's not a war room covered in maps and blinking screens. It's quieter than that. Carney surrounded himself with trade economists, central bank veterans, people who understand what it means when you change the routing of capital flows at scale. The question they were answering wasn't, how do we fight Trump? The question was, how do we make Canada less dependent on the United States before the next escalation comes? And what they built, methodically, without press releases, without triumphant announcements, was a framework. Link the European trade bloc to the Asia-Pacific trade bloc through Canada as a conduit. Align rules of origin across CPTPP and EU supply chains so that Canadian manufacturers can source from either system with equal tariff efficiency. Make the question of whether to buy American machinery or German machinery, American software or Japanese software, a genuinely competitive choice where Canada's domestic interests can be served by either option. The beauty of this strategy, from Carney's perspective, is its legality. Every sovereign nation on earth has the right to determine where it sources its imports. Every sovereign nation has the right to extend preferential access to trading partners it chooses. There is nothing the United States can do at the WTO, at the UN, or through any bilateral mechanism to prevent Canada from deciding to buy its industrial equipment from Dusseldorf instead of Detroit. Carney didn't build a weapon. He built an exit. Now here's what every other outlet is missing in their coverage of this trade war. The story isn't the tariffs. The tariffs are the surface. The story is what happens to the American export economy when a coordinated bloc of allied nations decides to systematically reduce its dependence on American goods, not in retaliation, not as punishment, but simply as prudent supply chain diversification in response to U.S. unpredictability. Let me translate what that means in plain language for anyone watching this who runs a business, owns a home, or has a retirement account. When the United States loses market share in advanced manufacturing exports, those are Caterpillar jobs in Peoria, Illinois. When American aerospace loses ground to Airbus because European governments start preferring European suppliers, that's Boeing jobs in Seattle and Everett, Washington. When American software loses enterprise contracts to SAP or to Asian cloud providers because foreign governments want to reduce their digital dependency on U.S. platforms, that's Microsoft revenue that doesn't come back. The tariff war that Trump framed as protecting American workers is, through the mechanism of allied retaliation and diversification, directly threatening the exact industrial base it claimed to protect. And the numbers here are not theoretical. U.S. goods exports totaled approximately $2.1 trillion in 2024. Canada alone absorbs about $350 billion of that annually. The EU collectively takes another $370 billion. The Asia-Pacific allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, take hundreds of billions more. When those markets start systematically redirecting procurement to non-American suppliers, the revenue loss doesn't show up overnight. It shows up in quarterly earnings calls, in layoff announcements, in factory consolidations. It shows up slowly enough that you can almost convince yourself it isn't happening, until one day the factory closes and it's permanent. Here is receipt number one. Trump's own approval rating on the economy has collapsed to 31%, a career low, confirmed by a CNN poll conducted by SSRS in early April 2026. Not 45, not even 40. 31% of Americans approve of how he is handling the economy. That number is lower than it was during the worst months of the 2008 financial crisis for the incumbent administration. And when you ask Americans specifically about their financial situation, 57% say their lives have become somewhat or much more difficult over the past 6 months. 67% say the country is on the wrong track. These are not numbers from a left-wing pollster. Rasmussen and Gallup are showing similar trajectories. Something structural is happening to American consumer confidence, and the trade war is at the center of it. Here is receipt number 2. Gas prices above $4 a gallon are now confirmed as causing financial hardship in 63% of American households, including 15% who describe that hardship as severe. That figure comes from the same SSRS polling data, and it is not a margin of error blip. It is a sustained reading across multiple survey periods. The mechanism here is the Iran war, which disrupted Strait of Hormuz shipping and spiked global oil prices, a conflict that the Carney government in Canada chose carefully not to publicly support once the costs became clear. The interaction between the tariff war, the Iran conflict, and domestic energy prices has created a compound economic squeeze on American households that is unlike anything seen in the modern polling era. Here is receipt number 3. Among Republicans specifically, the share of strong approvers of Trump's job performance fell from 52% in January to 43% by April, according to CNN polling. His economic approval among Republicans dropped 14 points across the same period. 14 points within his own base, among the voters who were supposed to be unshakable. The softening of Republican economic approval is the most politically significant number in any of this data because it is the leading indicator of what happens in the 2026 midterms. If that erosion continues through summer, the congressional math changes. And if the congressional math changes, Trump's ability to sustain the trade war without legislative pushback changes with it. Here is receipt number 4. The Democratic generic congressional ballot lead sits at 47.5% versus 41.8% for Republicans in the Real Clear polling aggregate as of early April 2026. A 5.7-point structural advantage on the generic ballot 6 months before midterm campaigns begin in earnest. Historical models suggest that a generic ballot gap of that magnitude, sustained over 2 polling cycles, translates to meaningful House seat losses for the majority party. The trade war, the Iran war, the gas prices, and the approval rating collapse are not separate political phenomena. They are a single compounding crisis expressed across 4 different metrics simultaneously. Here is the psychological layer that nobody on cable news is spending time on because cable news doesn't do psychology well. It does volume and heat. Trump's trade strategy was built on a theory of leverage. The theory goes like this: America is the dominant consumer market on Earth. The world needs access to American consumers more than America needs access to foreign markets. And therefore, America can impose costs on trading partners without suffering equivalent costs in return. That theory worked partially and temporarily, in the first term, when the countries being targeted were either genuinely asymmetric in their economic dependence on the U.S., or when they were isolated enough that coordinated retaliation was difficult to organize. Carney destroyed that theory's application to Canada methodically, because Canada is not a small economy. Canada is the world's 10th largest economy, with enormous natural resource reserves, a highly educated workforce, a stable currency, and existing trade relationships with virtually every major economy on Earth. Canada's leverage in this conflict was never zero. But Carney understood something crucial about leverage that Trump either doesn't understand or chooses to ignore. Leverage only works if the other side believes you might actually use it. And leverage grows when you stop being dependent on the party applying pressure to you. Every bilateral deal Carney signed, with China, with the UAE, with Indonesia, with the European framework partners, reduced Canada's asymmetric dependence on the American market. Every reduction in that dependence reduced America's leverage over Canada. And every reduction in America's leverage made Trump's next escalation slightly less effective than the previous one. This is the playbook of a central banker. It's not emotional. It's not theatrical. It's the slow, systematic restructuring of a balance sheet. Notice what Carney has not done through all of this. He has not insulted Trump personally in major public forums. He has not called press conferences to announce every Canadian retaliation as a victory. He has not turned this into a personality contest or a cable news war of sound bites. He has consistently described Canada's actions as defensive, prudent, and in service of Canadian workers. He has specifically avoided language that gives Trump an obvious rhetorical target. That restraint is a strategic choice. It denies Trump the enemy image that fuels his domestic narrative. Compare that to how Trump has responded. He has called Carney governor, the same dismissive framing he used for Trudeau, as a reference to his fantasy of annexing Canada as the 51st state. He has posted on Truth Social characterizing Canada's growing trade relationships with China as a betrayal. He has escalated tariffs each time Carney signed a new bilateral deal, seemingly expecting that one more escalation would finally break Canadian resolve. Instead, each escalation has pushed Carney further into the arms of the allies Trump simultaneously alienated with his global tariff regime. That is the trap. And Carney didn't build it. Trump built it himself. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about Canada. It is not even about tariffs. It is about whether the institutional architecture of the post-World War II trading order, the web of agreements, the predictability, the rules-based norms that allowed American manufacturers to build global supply chains, confident that the agreements underpinning those chains would hold, can survive a sustained assault from inside the system by the system's own originator. That is the existential question underneath all of this. Because when Canada starts routing its procurement to Germany, when it signs strategic partnerships with China and the UAE, when it works to align European and Asian supply chains in a framework that explicitly bypasses the United States, it is not just making a trade policy decision. It is making a judgment about American reliability. And that judgment, once made by a country that close, that aligned, that historically integrated, echoes in every capital on earth. The UK's Keir Starmer is watching this. France's Emmanuel Macron is watching this. Japan and South Korea, whose security relationships with the US are deep, and whose economies are deeply exposed to American trade policy volatility, are watching this and drawing conclusions. The question they are all privately asking is the same question Carney publicly answered. If the United States cannot be relied upon to honor its trade agreements with its closest neighbor and oldest ally, what does that imply about the reliability of American commitments more broadly? That question does not have a clean answer, and the discomfort of not having a clean answer is already reshaping the economic decisions of governments around the world. Think about the Boeing engineer in Everett, Washington, who is watching the order books shift. Think about the Caterpillar worker in Peoria, who is watching European governments tender construction equipment contracts that used to go to American manufacturers and now go to competitors in Stuttgart. These are not abstractions. These are people whose economic security was built on the assumption that American trade relationships were durable, that the rules would hold, that their company's global market access was a constant they could count on. That assumption is now in question in a way it has not been in their working lifetimes. Carney's press conference after the April 15 tariff relief announcement, where Canada paused certain retaliatory tariffs to ease pressure on Canadian manufacturers, was deliberate in its framing. He did not present it as a concession. He presented it as a strategic adjustment, a demonstration that Canada could manage its own economic policy with precision, easing pressure where it helped Canadian workers and maintaining it where it constrained American leverage. That framing matters. It signals to allies and to markets that Canada is not desperate, not cornered, not reacting. It is governing. 3 things to watch in the next 30 days. First, the April 28 Canadian federal election. Carney's Liberal Party is running against Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, and the entire campaign has crystallized around the question of who can best manage the relationship with a hostile United States. If Carney wins, even a minority government, it validates his strategy and gives him a mandate to continue. If he loses, the strategic framework he has built doesn't disappear overnight, but its momentum stalls. Second, the G7 summit in June, which Canada is hosting in Kananaskis, Alberta. That summit was always going to be consequential. Now it is a direct test of whether American isolation from its allies is formalized or paused. Third, the U.S. midterm election cycle beginning in earnest through the summer. Every percentage point of Republican economic approval erosion changes the political calculus inside Congress on whether to constrain Trump's trade authority. Watch the midterm generic ballot. Watch whether Carney gets his mandate on April 28th. Watch whether the G7 produces a communiqué that the United States can sign without embarrassment. The next 72 hours matter. But the next 90 days matter more, because what gets decided in that window about Canadian governance, about Allied coordination, about domestic American political will either stabilize this crisis or accelerate it into something that no tariff pause can undo. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening beneath the headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The financial media is covering the tariff numbers. The political media is covering the approval ratings. Nobody is connecting the central banking strategy, the Allied realignment, the domestic political collapse, and the systemic institutional question into a single coherent frame. That is what we do here. Drop a comment below. I want to know what you think. Is Carney's strategy a genuine, long-term restructuring that outlasts Trump? Or is this a short-term tactical play that collapses the moment Washington makes a credible offer? Two defensible answers. Make your case.